Her hand brushed my waist, firm yet gentle, and my whole body froze. I had only been at this new job for 3 days, but in that one touch, in the way her voice melted into my skin when she whispered, "Relax," I understood this wasn't just about work. My new boss wasn't just giving me instructions, she was unraveling something inside me I had kept hidden for so long. The office walls suddenly felt too small, my heart too loud, and I knew this story was about to change my life in ways I never dared to imagine. The first day I walked into that office, everything felt larger than me. The tall glass doors opened like they belonged to a world I wasn't sure I deserved to step into. My heart raced with the weight of new beginnings. I kept my head down, clutching the strap of my bag, pretending I was confident enough to belong there. The building smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the kind of scent that whispered of money, power, and long nights that stretched into mornings. My shoes clicked nervously against the marble floor as I approached the reception desk, smiling politely, though my palms were damp with sweat. I was terrified and excited at the same time, the way you feel when you know something in your life is about to shift forever. The receptionist welcomed me with a bright smile, told me my new boss would be with me shortly, and offered me water. I shook my head, worried my hands would tremble if I held the glass. So I just stood there, staring at the sleek walls, wondering what kind of woman I would be working for, wondering if she would see me as nothing more than another employee trying to prove herself. Then the elevator doors opened and she stepped out. Even from a distance, I could feel her presence. She walked like she owned the ground beneath her feet, each stride confident, heels clicking with authority. She wasn't tall, but she carried herself as if the world had no choice but to make space for her. Her hair was pinned neatly, her suit perfectly tailored, and her eyes sharp, scanning the room in a way that made everyone around her straighten their posture. When her gaze landed on me, my breath caught. She smiled, polite, professional, but her eyes lingered a fraction longer than necessary, and I felt something stir inside me that I didn't want to admit. She extended her hand and introduced herself. Her voice was low, steady, smooth in a way that wrapped around me like velvet. When I shook her hand, it was firm but not harsh, and for a moment, too long to be an accident, she held it before letting go. My skin tingled where she touched me, and I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I forced a smile, pretending nothing unusual had happened. She guided me into her office, and I followed silently, listening to the sound of her heels echoing against the floor. Her office was enormous, bookshelves lined with files, a large desk polished to perfection, and wide windows that let in sunlight like a spotlight cast across her empire. She gestured for me to sit while she leaned against her desk, arms crossed, watching me. Her eyes studied me with an intensity that made me shift in my chair, not because she was intimidating, but because it felt like she could see through me, peeling away layers I had carefully built over the years. She started asking questions about my background, my experience, why I wanted this job. I answered each one carefully, my voice steady even though my heart was racing. She nodded along, occasionally smiling, and though her words were all professional, there was something in the way she looked at me that made me feel more like I was being evaluated as a person rather than as an employee. By the time the meeting ended, she stood close, far closer than necessary, and when she leaned forward to hand me a folder, her hand brushed against my arm. It was such a simple touch, accidental perhaps, but it sent shivers down my spine. I told myself not to read into it, not to imagine things that weren't there. I reminded myself she was my boss, a woman with power and control, someone I needed to respect, not desire. But no matter how much I tried to silence it, the thought lingered, there was something about her that went beyond authority. That afternoon she walked me through the office, introducing me to the team, explaining routines, pointing out details with precision. Her voice was calm but commanding, and every time she leaned close to explain something, my chest tightened. At one point, as we stood by a window overlooking the city, she came up behind me to point at a building in the distance. Her hand, meant to gesture, landed lightly on my waist. "Relax," she said softly, almost like it was meant for more than just that moment. My whole body froze. I could feel the warmth of her palm through the thin fabric of my blouse, and my breath caught in my throat. I forced a nod, but inside, I knew something had shifted. This wasn't just a job anymore. I didn't know what it was becoming, but the truth was undeniable. I wanted more. The next few days passed in a blur, yet each moment seemed stitched together by her presence. I would arrive at the office early, hoping to compose myself before the rush began, but it was as if she was always there ahead of me, already settled, already in control. She had this habit of standing by the window with a cup of coffee in her hand, gazing at the skyline like she owned the city itself. The first time I caught her there, she turned and smiled, the kind of smile that seemed casual but lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. I tried to keep my thoughts straight, to remind myself that this was work, not some kind of personal awakening. Still, there was no denying the way my stomach flipped each time she spoke my name. The sound of it in her voice made me feel like I was more than just another employee. She gave me assignments that seemed almost too important for someone so new, and I poured everything into them, hoping she would notice my effort. And she did. She always noticed. A quick compliment here, a subtle nod there, it was never dramatic, but the acknowledgement was enough to keep me working late into the night just for the chance to hear her say I had done well. One afternoon she called me into her office. The blinds were half drawn, the light soft, and the air carried a faint trace of her perfume. I sat across from her desk, pretending to focus on the file she placed before me, but my eyes kept betraying me, tracing the curve of her jaw, the way her lips pressed together as she read. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, and began to explain the details of a project. Her voice was calm, steady, but as she spoke, she moved from behind the desk to stand beside me. She leaned over, pointing at the document in front of me, her shoulder brushing mine. I felt the warmth of her body so close that it made it hard to breathe. My pen trembled in my hand, though I prayed she wouldn't notice. But she did. She always noticed. She placed her hand lightly on mine, steadying it as though to guide me, and whispered, "Don't overthink it. You're doing fine." The contact was brief, fleeting, yet it sank deep into me like an anchor. I nodded, forcing myself to focus, but the moment left an afterglow I couldn't shake. Every part of me longed for it to last longer, yet I was terrified by how much I wanted something I wasn't supposed to want. That evening, as most of the office began to empty, she asked me to stay back and help with a proposal that needed finishing. My heart skipped at the thought of being alone with her, though I masked it with a professional smile. We worked side by side for hours, the quiet hum of the city below filtering through the glass walls. At one point, as I leaned forward to grab a pen, my hair slipped from behind my ear, falling across my face. Without hesitation, she reached out and tucked it back gently, her fingers brushing my cheek. The world seemed to still. I looked up at her, caught in her gaze, unable to move or speak. There was no smile this time, only a softness in her eyes, a question left hanging in the air between us. She withdrew her hand slowly, turning back to the papers as though nothing had happened, but I knew it had. I could still feel the ghost of her touch against my skin, burning quietly but intensely. I stayed later than I should have, gathering my things long after midnight. As I stepped toward the door, she stopped me. "You're adjusting well," she said, her voice lower than usual, as if it carried something unsaid. I nodded, murmuring my thanks, but inside I was unraveling. Every word, every touch, every glance was beginning to blur the line between professional and personal, and though I told myself to be careful, to guard my heart, the truth was undeniable. I wanted more, and I was terrified she might know it too. The following week began with a heaviness in my chest, a weight I carried each morning as I walked into the building. Every time I caught sight of her, whether it was her silhouette against the window or the sound of her heels echoing down the hall, I felt that same rush of heat and nervous energy. It was like my body had learned to respond before my mind could reason with it. She was my boss, my superior, the person who held my career in her hands, and yet my heart insisted on betraying me with every glance, every stolen moment. The more I tried to bury the feelings, the more they seemed to grow. That week, she began involving me more closely in meetings with clients, insisting that I shadow her, observe how she handled negotiations, how she commanded a room without ever raising her voice. Sitting beside her in those polished conference rooms, I saw a version of her that was both intimidating and magnetic. She spoke with confidence, her tone calm yet unshakable, and people leaned in when she talked, as if every word was a truth they needed to hear. I admired her, genuinely, but admiration wasn't the only thing rising in me. Every time her hand brushed mine when she passed me a document, every time her gaze lingered just a moment longer than necessary, I felt my resolve weakening. One afternoon, after a long meeting, she asked me to walk with her. We went down a quiet corridor, away from the usual bustle of the office. She carried herself with ease, her jacket draped over one arm, her other hand gesturing lightly as she explained details of the client we had just spoken with. I listened carefully, nodding at the right moments, but my attention was divided. I couldn't stop noticing how close she was, how the faintest trace of her perfume lingered in the air between us. Then she stopped abruptly, turning to face me. Her expression was calm, but her eyes seemed to pierce through me. "You're picking this up faster than I expected," she said softly. There was praise in her tone, but there was something else, something unspoken that hummed beneath the words. I swallowed hard, murmuring my thanks, though my voice betrayed a slight tremor. She tilted her head, studying me for a moment longer, and then, almost casually, she reached out and adjusted the collar of my blouse. It was a small gesture, innocent enough to be explained away, but the intimacy of it made my breath falter. Her fingers lingered for a fraction too long before she pulled back, her lips curving into the faintest smile. That evening, she called me into her office again. The blinds were half closed, the golden light of sunset spilling across her desk. I sat across from her, but it didn't feel like a business conversation. She asked about me, not my work, but me. Where I grew up, what I dreamed of, who I wanted to be. I answered hesitantly at first, unsure why she was asking, but as she listened, her eyes never leaving mine, I felt something shift. She wasn't just my boss in that moment. She was a woman peeling back my layers, revealing pieces of myself I rarely shared. When I admitted that I often felt like I didn't belong, like I was always trying to prove myself in places that didn't really want me, her expression softened. She leaned forward, resting her chin lightly on her hand, and said, "You belong more than you think. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The words settled deep inside me, a warmth spreading through my chest that had nothing to do with the office or the job. I wanted to hold on to that feeling, to the way she made me feel seen in a world that so often overlooked me. As I stood to leave, she walked me to the door. Before I could step out, she touched my arm lightly, stopping me. "You're stronger than you realize," she said quietly, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart stumble. For a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist, like there was only the two of us suspended in that silence. Then she let go, her hand falling back to her side, and I walked away with my pulse racing, my thoughts tangled in knots. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every second, every word, every touch. I knew I was standing on dangerous ground, but the truth I couldn't deny was that I didn't want to step back. Something had begun between us, something fragile yet electric, and no matter how much I told myself to resist, my heart was already moving toward her. The days that followed were filled with a strange kind of tension, the sort that could not be spoken aloud but hung in the air like a secret everyone else was blind to. I went about my work as though everything was normal, drafting reports, answering emails, shadowing her during meetings, but inside I was constantly aware of her. It was in the way she walked past my desk, the light brush of her hand against my shoulder as she leaned to point something out, the low tone of her voice when she spoke my name. I told myself over and over to stay focused, to remember why I was here, yet every part of me was tuned to her presence as if nothing else mattered. That week, she asked me to accompany her to an evening event, a networking dinner hosted in one of the city's grand hotels. I hesitated when she mentioned it, unsure if I would fit in, unsure if people would wonder why she chose me out of everyone on her team. But she looked at me with steady eyes and said, "I want you there. You'll learn more by being in the room than by reading about it in reports." I agreed, though my nerves twisted tight inside me. On the night of the event, I stood outside the hotel doors, adjusting my dress nervously, my reflection staring back at me from the glass. I had never been in a place so polished, with chandeliers glowing like constellations and laughter spilling into the night air. When I stepped inside, I spotted her almost instantly. She stood among a group of men in expensive suits, and yet she was the one who commanded the space. Her dress was simple but elegant, her hair falling in loose waves instead of the usual neat bun, and when her eyes found mine across the room, my breath caught. She excused herself from the group and came toward me, her gaze never faltering. "You look beautiful," she said softly, just for me, before leading me into the crowd. No one else would think twice about her words, but I felt them like a touch, sinking deep into my skin. Throughout the evening, I followed her lead, shaking hands, exchanging polite conversation, watching how she navigated every interaction with ease. She introduced me not as an assistant or a junior employee, but as someone important to her team, someone she trusted. The pride in her voice when she said my name left me both humbled and exhilarated. Later in the evening, as the noise swelled and people gathered in clusters, she leaned close to me, her breath brushing against my ear. "Step outside with me for a moment," she whispered, and my heart tumbled in my chest. We slipped away from the ballroom and onto a balcony that overlooked the city lights. The air was cool, a welcome relief from the warmth inside, and the sound of distant traffic rose up from the streets below. She stood beside me, silent for a moment, before speaking. "How are you finding it all?" she asked, her voice softer now, less guarded. I admitted that it was overwhelming, that I felt out of place among so many powerful people. She turned to me then, her eyes steady on mine, and said, "You belong here just as much as anyone else. Don't let yourself believe otherwise." The sincerity in her words made my throat tighten. I nodded, but she stepped closer, her presence filling the space between us. She reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair away from my face, and for a second the world seemed to pause. Her hand lingered near my cheek, her eyes searching mine, and I could feel the unspoken question hanging there, heavy and undeniable. I didn't move, didn't breathe, caught in the gravity of that moment. Then she let her hand fall, turning her gaze back to the city as if nothing had happened. We stood there in silence, side by side, but inside me, everything was burning. The rest of the evening passed in a haze, the sound of voices and clinking glasses fading into the background. When she offered to drive me home, I accepted, though my pulse raced the entire ride. The car was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine, and every so often, I caught her glancing at me, her lips pressed into the faintest smile. When we pulled up to my apartment building, she put the car in park but didn't unlock the doors right away. Instead, she turned to me, her eyes lingering in the dim light. "You're doing better than you realize," she said quietly. "Don't doubt yourself." I murmured a thank you, though it felt like my voice belonged to someone else. She smiled softly, then leaned just slightly closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her presence before she stopped herself and pulled back. "Good night," she said simply, unlocking the doors. I stepped out into the night air, my legs unsteady, my heart thundering in my chest. As her car pulled away, I stood there watching the taillights fade, every part of me trembling with the certainty that something was building between us, something that neither of us could keep hidden much longer. The morning after that night at the hotel, I woke with a kind of restlessness that I couldn't shake. My body was exhausted, but my mind was wide awake, replaying the moments we had shared on that balcony, the warmth of her hand brushing against my face, the weight of her gaze that seemed to pierce through everything I tried to hide. I told myself over and over that nothing had really happened, that she hadn't crossed any line, that perhaps it was all in my head, but my heart refused to be silenced. When I stepped into the office that day, Everything looked the same, the glass doors, the steady hum of conversation, the scent of coffee in the air, but something between us had shifted. It was subtle, invisible to anyone else, but I could feel it in the way her eyes found mine when she walked into the room, in the pause of her smile when she greeted me, in the way my breath caught before I could respond. I tried to bury myself in work, keeping my head down, determined not to let my emotions betray me, but she had other plans. That afternoon she asked me to join her in the small conference room for a private review of the project we had been working on. I carried the files in, my hands trembling slightly, and found her standing by the window again, her figure framed by the daylight spilling in. She turned as I entered, her expression calm but unreadable, and motioned for me to sit. We went through the details slowly, her questions precise, her feedback thoughtful, but I found it difficult to focus on the papers between us. My eyes betrayed me again and again, flicking up to catch the curve of her lips, the way her hair caught the light, the intensity of her gaze whenever she looked at me. At one point she leaned over the table, close enough that her sleeve brushed against my arm, and I could feel the warmth of her body. My pen slipped from my hand, clattering softly against the table. She picked it up for me, her fingers brushing mine as she placed it back in my hand, and in that small, simple touch, I felt something electric ripple through me. For a moment neither of us moved, her hand still resting lightly against mine, her eyes locking onto mine with a question she didn't voice. I swallowed hard, unable to look away, and then she pulled back slowly, her lips curving into a faint smile that made my heart stumble. We continued the meeting, but the air between us had changed, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. When it ended, she stood close as she handed me the folder, her hand grazing mine again. "You're improving quickly," she said softly, her voice carrying more weight than the words themselves. I nodded, barely able to speak, and slipped out of the room, my pulse racing. That evening, as the office emptied and the quiet settled in, she appeared by my desk. "Stay a little longer," she said gently, "I'd like your help finalizing this presentation." I agreed, though I knew it wasn't just the work that kept me there. We sat together in her office, the city lights glowing outside the wide windows, the atmosphere hushed and intimate. Hours passed without me noticing, the world shrinking down to just the two of us. At one point, she rose from her chair and walked around to stand beside me, leaning close as we reviewed the slides on my laptop. Her hand rested lightly on the back of my chair, her presence surrounding me, her scent filling the air. My chest tightened, every nerve in my body alive with the awareness of her so near. When she leaned closer to point something out, her lips were only inches from my ear, her voice low, intimate, sending shivers racing down my spine. I turned my head slightly, and suddenly we were face to face, our eyes meeting in the dim light. Time seemed to stop. Her gaze dropped briefly to my lips, then back to my eyes, and I felt the world tilt. My breath caught, and before I could think, before I could pull myself back into reason, she lifted her hand and placed it gently against my cheek. Her touch was soft, almost hesitant, but filled with something deeper, something unspoken yet undeniable. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body leaned into her touch as though it had been waiting for it all along. She held my gaze, her thumb brushing lightly across my skin, and whispered, "Relax." The word echoed inside me, the same word she had spoken on my first day, but now it meant something entirely different. It wasn't instruction anymore, it was invitation. My chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, the silence between us louder than any words could be. Then, as if catching herself, she slowly let her hand fall away, stepping back, her expression guarded once again. "That's enough for tonight," she said quietly, turning back toward her desk. I gathered my things with trembling hands, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. As I walked out of her office, I knew the line between us had blurred beyond repair, and no matter how hard we tried, we could never go back to what we were before. The next morning arrived with a strange heaviness, as if the night before had pressed its mark onto me and refused to fade. I woke earlier than usual, staring at the ceiling in silence, my thoughts spiraling back to the way her hand had rested against my cheek, the softness in her eyes when she whispered that single word. I told myself over and over that I had imagined it, that maybe it was just a slip of the moment, nothing intentional, nothing meant to linger. But my heart betrayed me with every beat, reminding me of the warmth that had settled into my skin, the way her touch had felt like both a question and an answer I wasn't ready to face. I walked into the office determined to keep my composure, determined to put walls back around myself, to bury everything under professionalism and distance. But when I saw her, all those defenses began to crumble. She was already there, as always, standing near the window with her coffee in hand, the morning light outlining her like a painting. When her eyes met mine, she gave me a small smile, polite, nothing unusual, but there was a flicker in her gaze, something unspoken that made my chest tighten. I greeted her with the same practiced smile, pretending that I wasn't falling apart inside. Throughout the day, we kept our distance, at least on the surface. Our conversations were clipped, work-focused, polite to the point of stiffness. But every time her hand brushed mine when passing a file, every time her shoulder brushed against me as she leaned closer to look at a document, the tension grew thicker, stretching taut between us like a thread ready to snap. I caught her watching me once during a meeting, her gaze lingering too long before she looked away. It left me shaken, wondering if she felt the same pull, or if I was just spinning my own illusions. Later that evening, when most of the staff had already left, I stayed behind to finish a report. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that made every sound echo. I was so focused on my work that I didn't notice her at first. Then I looked up and saw her standing in the doorway of my cubicle, leaning casually against the frame, her arms crossed. My breath hitched at the sight of her there, watching me. "You work too hard," she said softly, her voice carrying a gentleness I hadn't expected. I forced a small laugh, trying to deflect, but she stepped inside, her heels clicking softly against the floor until she stood beside my desk. She glanced at the papers scattered in front of me, then back at me. "You don't need to prove yourself to me," she said, her tone quiet but firm. "You already have." The words landed with a weight that left me silent. I looked up at her, unsure how to respond, my heart racing in my chest. She held my gaze, and for a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she reached out, slowly, almost cautiously, and rested her hand on mine. The touch was warm, steady, deliberate this time. My breath caught, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Her thumb brushed gently across the back of my hand, a tender motion that sent shivers up my arm. "You need to relax," she whispered again, her voice so low it felt like it belonged only to me. My chest rose and fell with uneven breaths, every nerve in my body alight. I wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but my voice failed me. Instead, I let the silence answer for me, the stillness of the moment louder than words could ever be. She moved closer, her presence surrounding me, her scent filling the air between us. My pulse thundered in my ears, my body torn between fear and desire, between reason and the pull of something undeniable. She leaned down just slightly, her face inches from mine, her eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me tremble. For a second, I thought she would close the distance, that the invisible line between us would finally be crossed. But then she stopped, her lips parting as if to speak, before she pulled back with a quiet sigh. She let go of my hand, the warmth fading from my skin, and straightened her posture. "Go home," she said softly, her tone a mix of command and care. "Get some rest." I nodded, my voice trapped in my throat, gathering my things with shaking hands. As I walked out into the night, the city lights blurring around me, I knew nothing about this was simple anymore. The line between us wasn't just blurred, it was gone, erased by every touch, every glance, every word she whispered only for me. And yet, neither of us dared to say it aloud. The days that followed were some of the most confusing of my life. Every morning I woke with the same weight in my chest, The same racing thoughts that tangled together until I could barely tell if what I was feeling was real or just a dangerous dream I refused to let go of. I told myself to keep my head down, to focus only on the work, but every time I stepped into that office, every time I saw her standing there with her calm authority, all my carefully built walls crumbled like dust. There was no escaping the way she made me feel, no way to ignore the heat that rose inside me each time her eyes found mine. The more I tried to push it down, the more it grew, until it filled every corner of my thoughts. That week, she asked me to join her on a business trip. It was only a short drive to a neighboring city for a client meeting, nothing unusual in the professional world, but the moment she told me, my heart twisted. Spending hours in a car with her, hours in a hotel where we would be away from the safe boundaries of the office, it was both everything I longed for and everything I feared. Still, I agreed, because how could I not? I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing her, of missing the chance to be close to her even if it tore me apart inside. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the engine filling the silence between us. I stared out the window, pretending to be lost in thought, but really I was memorizing every detail of her presence, the way her hands gripped the wheel, the curve of her profile lit by the sunlight, the calm steadiness of her breathing. She glanced at me occasionally, her lips curling into faint smiles, as though she knew exactly what I was doing but chose not to call me out on it. As the miles passed, our conversation slowly unfolded. We talked about work at first, then drifted into lighter topics, stories from our pasts that carried laughter and unexpected truths. She told me about her early years, the struggles she faced to build her career, the loneliness that came with always having to prove herself in a world that doubted her. I listened closely, surprised by the vulnerability in her words, the way her voice softened when she spoke about the sacrifices she had made. In return, I shared pieces of myself I rarely admitted aloud, the insecurities that haunted me, the fear of never being enough, the constant need to please everyone around me. She glanced at me then, her eyes lingering a second too long, and said quietly, "You are enough. More than enough." My throat tightened at the weight of her words, and I turned away, afraid she would see the tears forming in my eyes. That night, after the meeting, we returned to the hotel. Our rooms were next to each other, the thin walls separating us but doing nothing to quiet the restless energy that pulsed through me. I tried to focus on my work, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying every word, every glance, every moment from the day. When a knock came at my door, I froze. My heart knew it was her before I even opened it. She stood there in the dim hallway light, no longer in her polished suit but in something softer, more casual. Seeing her like that, stripped of the armor she always wore, made my breath falter. She asked if I wanted to go over some of the notes from the meeting, but the way her voice dipped, the way her eyes avoided mine, told me it wasn't just about work. I let her in, and we sat on the edge of the bed with the papers spread between us, pretending to focus. But our hands kept brushing, our eyes kept meeting, and the air grew heavier with every passing second. At one point, she leaned closer to show me a detail on the page, her shoulder pressing against mine. I turned my head, and suddenly we were so close I could feel her breath on my lips. Neither of us moved for a long moment, caught in the gravity of something we had both been fighting for weeks. My chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths, my body trembling under the weight of it all. And then she whispered again, softer than ever before, "Relax." The words sank into me, unraveling every defense I had left. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. My heart knew what my mind was too afraid to admit. We had already crossed the line long before that moment, and there was no turning back now. That night changed everything, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the quiet certainty of knowing we could no longer hide from what had been growing between us. After that whispered word, after the charged silence that followed, the distance we had been clinging to dissolved. She didn't kiss me, and I didn't lean forward, but the space between us shifted into something fragile and undeniable, something we both felt but were afraid to name. We sat there on the bed with the papers scattered around us, our hands brushing more often, our shoulders pressed together as though gravity itself had decided we belonged closer than we had allowed ourselves to be. The night stretched on, and though the notes remained untouched, our conversation deepened. We spoke about fear, about the masks we wore in order to survive in a world that often misunderstood us. She told me about the sacrifices she had made, the people she had lost, the parts of herself she had hidden away to maintain the image of strength. I listened, my chest tightening as I realized that beneath her armor she was just as vulnerable as I was, just as hungry for connection, just as terrified of being seen too deeply. In turn, I opened up in ways I never thought I could. I told her about the loneliness that followed me like a shadow, about the years I spent convincing myself to fit into boxes I didn't belong to, about the ache of wanting something more but being too afraid to reach for it. She didn't interrupt or look away. She held my gaze through it all, her eyes soft and steady, as if she was silently telling me that I didn't need to be ashamed, that I didn't need to hide. At some point the clock ticked past midnight, but neither of us moved to end the night. The hotel room was quiet except for our voices, and it felt as though the world outside had disappeared. When I grew quiet, she reached out slowly, hesitating for a fraction of a second before letting her fingers rest against the back of my hand. It wasn't rushed or impulsive, it was deliberate, careful, as if she was asking for permission without words. I didn't pull away. Instead, I turned my palm upward and intertwined my fingers with hers. That simple act, so small yet so profound, made my heart race harder than anything else could. Her thumb brushed gently against my skin, and I could feel her breath hitch, even though she tried to steady it. For the first time, neither of us pretended. Neither of us buried the truth under professionalism or restraint. We simply sat there, hand in hand, in the quiet glow of something real. When it grew too late to ignore the exhaustion, she finally stood. Her hand lingered in mine until the last possible second, and when she pulled away, she gave me a look that said everything words couldn't. Without a sound, she left the room, and I was left with the echo of her touch, the weight of her presence still surrounding me. That night I barely slept, but for once it wasn't because of fear or doubt. It was because for the first time I felt something I had never allowed myself to feel fully before: hope. The next morning, when we returned to the office, the world looked the same to everyone else. We walked through the doors as if nothing had changed, we exchanged professional words in front of the team, and no one suspected a thing. But between us, everything was different. It was in the way her eyes lingered when she thought no one was watching, in the way my hand would brush against hers as we passed each other papers, in the quiet smiles that spoke louder than words. The line we had fought so hard to keep intact no longer existed. It wasn't just a job anymore, and it never would be again. Something deeper had begun, something fragile and powerful, something neither of us could deny. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. For the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, what I had been searching for all along had been waiting for me in the unexpected warmth of her hand on my waist, and in the way she taught me that sometimes the only way forward is to finally relax and let yourself be seen.